welcome to the Gaming Historian. Cheating in video games. Everyone's tried it at least some point in their life. Whether it's for extra lives in Contra, or to jump higher in Super Mario Bros., players use cheats to help them get through a game, or just to experience it in a whole new way. Cheating has been around almost as long as video games have. Early cheat codes were mostly used to assist developers and playtesters of a game. Soon, game designers were purposely adding them into games for players to discover. Most early cheats needed a passcode entered, such as the infamous Konami code. But there also exist cheat cartridges which would plug into a game console and modify the game's data. Several of these existed, but probably the most well-known device was the Game Genie. Of course, they wouldn't admit it was a cheat device. It was marketed as a video game enhancer, and that players could unlock the power of their favorite video games. But most kids, including myself, called it a cheat device. Anytime we got stuck on a game, we just fired up the Game Genie and it was smooth sailing from there. The Game Genie was developed by a UK-based company known as Codemasters. Back in the NES days, they were known for developing unlicensed games, like this Quattro Adventures cart. Originally known as the Power Pack, the Game Genie was licensed to Camerica for release in Canada and Galoob Toys for the United States. It was at this time that Nintendo got involved and took legal action against both companies to prevent the device from being released in North America. We'll begin with Camerica. Camerica was a small Canadian video game company, mostly known for releasing Codemasters' unlicensed games. When they were preparing to release the Game Genie, Nintendo quickly sued, saying the device infringed on their copyright. The case was quickly dismissed in courts, and Camerica soon released the Game Genie in Canada, running full-page ads stating, "Thank you, Canada." Many eager gamers imported the device from Canada, while the release was delayed in the United States. Then there was Galoob Toys. Galoob produced some of the most popular toy lines in the 80s and 90s, including Pound Puppies and Micro Machines. At one point, they were the third largest toy company, behind Mattel and Hasbro. When Galoob secured the license to the Game Genie, Nintendo claims they approached them about getting it officially endorsed by them. Galoob denies that this happened. Nevertheless, Nintendo took legal action against Galoob. Howard Lincoln, Nintendo's vice president and legal expert, said, "It creates derivative works. It not only alters Nintendo games, infringing on copyrights, but can make them less fun, too easy to play." Galoob's vice president, Stephen Klein, thought differently. "It's just like a book. If you want to start at chapter 11, you can. If the kid wants to start at World 8 because he's been through all the earlier levels before and doesn't want to spend an hour doing it again, why shouldn't he be able to?" So what did the court decide? District Court Judge Fern Smith sided with Galoob in a decision that addressed two main issues. First, that when customers use the Game Genie to temporarily alter copyrighted Nintendo video games for their own enjoyment, they do not create a derivative work. For those wondering, a derivative work is an artistic or literary work derived from one or more existing works. An example would be if I took this lovely picture and drew googly eyes on it. Nintendo argued that the Game Genie was a derivative work and therefore violated the Copyright Act. The court disagreed. The court concluded that the inherent concept of a derivative work is that it be able to exist on its own, in a separate form, but the Game Genie does not meet that definition. Second, that the doctrine of fair use enables consumers to use Game Genie for their personal enjoyment, and therefore allows the Game Genie to be sold. If a player purchased a Nintendo game, he was protected under fair use to modify the game for his own pleasure. Galoob emerged victorious and soon after released the Game Genie. Camerica, wanting to concentrate on other projects, and knowing Galoob was a much bigger company, sold their rights to Galoob. Most people, including myself, have the Galoob Game Genie, but if you have the Camerica version, congrats. They're a bit harder to find. Now let's take a look at the Game Genie itself. It's pretty simple to use. You just plug the game you want to play into the cartridge here, and then plug the Game Genie into the Nintendo. When you power up the console, a code screen will appear. So, bust out your code book, or hop on the internet, and enter all the codes you want. So how did this thing work? Well, I'm no engineer or anything, but here's the easiest way I can explain it. Basically, the Game Genie interrupted communication between the chips inside the game and the chips inside the NES. Let's say you're playing Super Mario Bros. With an infinite lives code entered into the Game Genie. Imagine you die by running into this Goomba. The game chip will send a signal saying, this player has 2 lives left. The Game Genie will take that and modify it to say, this player has 3 lives left. Then send the data on its way. Thus, you'll never run out of lives. A codebook came with every Game Genie, containing codes for various games. One interesting thing you could do was program your own codes. Galoob encouraged players to try it out by including a small guide in their codebooks. It's pretty cool because you can do all sorts of crazy things with your games. Game Genie codes only lasted as long as the system power was turned on, so if a code made your game look crazy, you could just turn the system off and on to try again. This book doesn't have every NES game, so how did Galoob provide codes for new games? Well, in the back of the code book, you could subscribe to Game Genie code updates. Every year, you'd get 4 new code books with the latest games. You know, reading this code book is like taking a trip back to the early 90s. Galoob wrote a little paragraph about each game that's in this code book, and it's fun to read what they said. Mega Man 3 says, check out the radical codes for the awesome Mega Man 3. Now, a lot of people have asked me if the Game Genie works on the NES too. Well, not out of the box. If you tried it, it would probably get stuck. Did Nintendo design the NES 2 in a way so that the Game Genie wouldn't fit? Well, maybe. Nevertheless, Galoob did design an adapter so that the Game Genie would fit safely into the NES 2. Now, if you thought the NES 2 was hard to find, this adapter is even harder. It was made in limited quantities at the end of the console's life. Besides the original Game Genie, there were versions for the Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, Game Boy, and Game Gear. Sega made it an officially licensed product, probably to win over some gamers after Nintendo took Galoob to court. By 1997, the Super Nintendo was on the outs, and the Game Genie was officially discontinued. In 1998, Hasbro announced it was purchasing Galoob for $220 million. The Game Genie is important for several reasons. Galoob vs. Nintendo was an important case of intellectual property and what constituted fair use in the video game industry. The Game Genie also played a big part in making cheat devices more popular and user-friendly. Today you've got the Codebreaker, Action Replay, and Game Shark for various systems. That's all for this episode of The Game Historian. Thanks for watching.